The horrors of Unit 731. Unit 731, officially known as the Manchu Detachment 731, and also referred to as the Kamo Detachment, and after its commander, General Shiro Ishii, as the Ishii Unit, was a secret research facility operated by the Imperial Japanese Army from 1936 until 1945. It was located in the Pingfang district of Harbin in the Japanese puppet state of Manchuria, or Manchukuo, in what is today Heilongjiang province in northeast China. Unit 731 was responsible for large-scale biological and chemical warfare research, as well as lethal human experimentation. The facility was operated under the command of General Shiro Ishii and received strong support from the Japanese military. The activities of Unit 731 included infecting prisoners with deadly diseases, conducting vivisection, performing organ harvesting, testing hyperbaric chambers, amputating limbs, and exposing victims to chemical agents and explosives. Prisoners, often referred to as logs by the staff, were mostly Chinese citizens, but also included Russians, Koreans, and Mongolians. Among those experimented upon were children and pregnant women. An estimated 14,000 people were killed inside the facility, while biological weapons developed by Unit 731 caused the deaths of at least 200,000 people in Chinese cities and villages through the deliberate contamination of water supplies, food, and agricultural land. After the war, just 12 Unit 731 members were tried by the Soviet Union in the 1949 Khabarov war crimes trials and sentenced to terms in prison. However, many key figures, including the commander Ishii, were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their research data. The US administration under Harry S. Truman concealed the unit's crimes and paid stipends to former personnel. It was not until the 28th of August 2002 under the Tokyo District Court formally acknowledged that Japan had conducted biological warfare in China and held the state responsible for related deaths. Although both the United States and the Soviet Union acquired and studied the data, later evaluations found it offered little practical scientific value. Some of the information in this video you may find disturbing, but it is all fact that needs to be available and not covered up by past governments and institutions. Founding and formations. Japan initiated its biological weapons program during the 1930s due to the prohibition of biological weapons in interstate conflicts by the Geneva Protocol of 1925. The Japanese reasoned that the ban verified its effectiveness as a weapon. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, and one of the outcomes of that occupation was the building of Unit 731, with the reasoning the research station was separate from their islands and they had access to as many Chinese people as they required for use as test subjects. The Japanese viewed the Chinese people as no-cost assets and hoped the research would give them an advantage in biological warfare. Most of the victims were Chinese, although there were some from other countries including Russia and Korea. The facilities at Unit 731 contained more than just those for medical research and experimentation. They also contained areas for detaining victims, essentially functioning as a prison. The research and experimentation rooms were constructed around the inner detention area, enabling researchers to conduct their daily work while the prisoners were monitored. Founded in 1936, Unit 731 was expanded to include up to 3,000 staff, 150 structures, and a capacity to detain up to 600 prisoners at any time. Ishii Network. Unit 731 was a clandestine division of Japan's Kwantung Army and based in Manchuria during the Second Sino-Japanese War and the subsequent Second World War. It was commanded by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii and was an organization dedicated to the advancement of biological weaponry within the Imperial Army and was regularly referred to as the Ishii Network. The Ishii Network was headquartered at the Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory, originally established in 1932 at the Japanese Army Military Medical School in Tokyo, Japan. Unit 731 was the first of several covert units established as offshoots of the original research lab and served as a field station and experimental site for advanced biological warfare techniques. The research conducted included the experimental deployment of biological weapons on Chinese cities. A direct breach of the 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibited the use of biological and chemical weapons in warfare. The participants in these activities were aware of the violations and recognized the inhumanity of using human subjects in laboratory experiments, prompting the establishment of Unit 731 and other secret sites within China and elsewhere. Under the direction of Shiro Ishii, the Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory was established after his return from a 2-year exploration of American and European research institutions. With the endorsement of high-ranking military officials, Unit 731 was established for the purpose of developing biological weapons. Ishii's aim was to create biological weapons with humans as the intended victims, and Unit 731 was formed specifically for this objective. Ishii organized a secret research group known as the Togo Unit for chemical and biological experimentation in Manchuria. The Japanese Emperor Hirohito issued a decree in 1936 authorizing the expansion of the unit and its integration into the Kwantung Army as an epidemic prevention department. At that time, it was divided into the Ishii Unit and the Wakamatsu Unit, with the latter based in Xinjiang. From August 1940, the two units were collectively known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, or by shortened version of Unit 731. Even the title of the unit, Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification, was misleading. Support for Shiro Ishii. One of the most instrumental supporters of Ishii was Colonel Chikahiko Koizumi, who would later be promoted to serve as the Japanese Health Minister from 1941 until 1945. Koizumi had been part of a secret poison gas research committee in 1915 during the First World War, when he and other Imperial Japanese Army officers had been impressed by the successful use by the German Army of chlorine gas during the Second Battle of Ypres, an event that had led to the deaths of over 6,000 Allied soldiers and another 15,000 wounded as a result of the chemical attack. Zongma Fortress. Unit Togo was set in motion in the Zongma Fortress, a prison and experimentation camp located at Baiyinhe, a village 100 kilometers south of Harbin on the South Manchuria Railway. The majority of the prisoners brought to Zongma included common criminals, captured bandits, anti-Japanese partisans, in addition to political prisoners and people rounded up on false charges by the Kempeitai, or Japanese military police. Prisoners were generally well fed on a diet of rice or wheat, meat, fish, and occasionally alcohol in order to be in a state of reasonable health when experimentation began. Once the experimentation period on a prisoner began, they were, over several days, drained of blood and deprived of nutrients and water. Their state of deteriorating health was then recorded. Some then faced vivisection, while for others they were deliberately infected with plague bacteria and other microbes. A prison break in the autumn of 1934, which jeopardized the secrecy of the facility, followed by an explosion in 1935, which was believed to have been an act of sabotage, led to the Zongma fortress being shut down by Ishii. Shiro Ishii then received authorization to move the facility to Pingfang, around 24 kilometers south of Harbin, where he set up a new and much larger facility. Other units. In addition to the establishment of Unit 731, there was also the call for the creation of additional units. The Biological Warfare Development Unit later became known as the Kwantung Army Military Horse Epidemic Prevention Workshop, later to be known as Manchuria Unit 100, and a Chemical Warfare Development Unit known as the Kwantung Army Technical Testing Department, later to be known as Manchuria Unit 516. After the Japanese invasion of the remainder of China in 1937, further chemical and biological warfare units were founded across China in major cities and known as Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Units. Detachments included Unit 1855 in Beijing, Unit EI 1644 in Nanjing, Unit 8604 in Guangzhou, and later units across Southeast Asia, including Unit 9420 in Singapore, and with other units created in Malaya, Indonesia, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Thailand, and Burma. All of these units were based on Ishii's network, which at its height in 1939 oversaw more than 10,000 personnel, including medical doctors and professors from Japan. All were attracted to join Unit 731 by the rare opportunity to conduct human experimentation, as well as the strong financial backing offered by the Japanese military. Experiments. The Japanese military police and the Special Services Agency had the responsibility of finding victims to be test subjects for Unit 731, while a team of physicians were responsible for maintaining the health of victims until they were dispatched for experimentation. Not everyone sent to Unit 731 underwent experiments, as these were reserved only for healthy individuals, and once accepted into the program, the preservation of their health became a priority until the time of experimentation. This, in my opinion, showed how deranged this thinking was. Ensure each test subject was in the best of health before then destroying them through experimentation. Experiments on the human victims included intentional infection. This method is especially used on Chinese prisoners of war, as well as civilians. They were subjected to illegal under international conventions, disease-causing agents, exposure to bombs designed to disperse infectious substances upon contact with the skin. There are no recorded survivors of any experimentation, and those that did not die from infections were subsequently murdered for autopsy analysis. Once experimentation was complete, those that survived experiments were killed by researchers through potassium cyanide or chloroform. American historian Sheldon H. Harris wrote, "The Togo unit employed gruesome tactics to secure specimens of select body organs. If Ishii or one of his co-workers wished to do research on the human brain, they would order the guards to find them a useful sample. A prisoner would be taken from his cell. Guards would hold him while another guard would smash the victim's head open with an axe. His brain would then be extracted off to the pathologist and then to the crematorium for the usual disposal." Nakagawa Yonenzo, a professor at Osaka University, studied at Kyoto University during the war. During his studies, he watched footage of human experiments and executions from Unit 731. He later testified about the playfulness of the experimenters. He stated that some of the experiments had nothing to do with advancing the capability of germ warfare or of medicine. There is such a thing as professional curiosity. What would happen if we did such and such? What medical purpose was served by performing and studying beheadings? None at all. That was just playing around. Professional people too like to play. Prisoners were injected with diseases disguised as vaccinations to study their effects, to study the effects of untreated venereal diseases. Male and female prisoners were deliberately infected with syphilis and gonorrhea, then studied. Maruta, a special project codenamed Maruta, used human beings for experiments. Test subjects were gathered from the surrounding population and sometimes euphemistically referred to as logs, Maruta in Japanese, and used in contexts such as how many logs fell. This term originated as a joke among the staff because the official cover story for the facility given to local authorities was that it was a lumber mill. A junior uniformed civilian employee of the Japanese Imperial Army working in Unit 731 stated that the project was internally called Holzkreuz from the German word for log. Later, researchers into Unit 731 published their results in peer-reviewed journals that included other derogatory terms for the victims as research being conducted on non-human primates and referred to them as Manchurian monkeys and long-tailed monkeys. Hideo Shimizu joined a group of miners at the age of 14 assigned to Unit 731 on the encouragement of his former school teacher. He was among the fourth group of miners to be assigned to the facility. His later testimony recalled a specimen room of jars of varying heights, some the height of an adult. The jars held body parts such as heads and hands from human victims preserved in formalin. Another contained the body of a pregnant woman. The lower part of her body was exposed to reveal the fetus of an unborn child she was carrying, complete with hair. Shimizu also revealed that the term logs was used to dehumanize prisoners, and the facilities they were housed in were referred to as log cabins. Vivisection. Thousands of men, women and children, including infants, were interned at prisoner of war camps and subjected to vivisection by their Japanese captors. These procedures were usually performed without any form of anesthesia and were thus usually lethal. In a video interview, Okawa Fukumatsu, a former staff member at Unit 731, admitted to carrying out a vivisection on a pregnant woman. Vivisections were performed on prisoners after they were infected with various diseases. Researchers would then perform invasive surgery, removing organs to study the effects of the disease on the human body. Horrific surgery included limbs being amputated purely to study the rate of blood loss. Some limbs were reattached to the opposite side of the victims' bodies for study purposes. Some operations included organs being reattached elsewhere on the body, apparently under the hypothesis of study, yet macabre in reality. Other victims had all or parts of organs removed, such as heart, lungs, brain and liver. One of the leading surgeons, Imperial Japanese Army surgeon Ken Yuasa, made the claim that practicing vivisection on human subjects was widespread even outside Unit 731, and estimated that at least 1,000 Japanese personnel were involved in the practice of vivisection in mainland China. Yuasa further made the claim that when he performed vivisection on captives, they were all for practice rather than for research, and that such practices were routine among Japanese doctors stationed in China during the war. The New York Times interviewed a former member of Unit 731 who insisted on his remaining anonymous. The former Japanese medical assistant recounted his first experience of vivisection on a live human being who had been deliberately infected with the plague for the purpose of developing so-called plague bombs for the war. The medical assistant recounted the event. The fellow knew it was over for him, so he didn't struggle when they led him into the room and tied him down. But when I picked up the scalpel, that's when he began screaming. I cut him open from the chest to the stomach, and he screamed terribly, and his face was twisted in agony. He made this unimaginable sound. He was screaming so horribly, but then finally he stopped. This was all in a day's work for the surgeons, but in reality left an impression on me because it was my first time. Information from other sources stated that it was normal practice for surgeons to stuff a rag or medical gauze into the mouths of prisoners before they commenced with vivisection in order to stifle any screaming. Biological warfare. Unit 731 and its affiliated units were involved in research, development and experimental deployment of epidemic-creating biological weapons in assaults against the Chinese population, both civilian and military, throughout World War II. By 1939, Ishii had condensed his laboratory discoveries to 6 potent pathogens, namely anthrax, typhoid, paratyphoid, glanders, dysentery and plague-infected human fleas. These agents were robust enough to ignite epidemics of considerable magnitude and resilient to aerial dispersal. This marked the initiation of the latter phase of Ishii's elaborate scheme. Conducting field trials through military expeditions on unsuspecting civilians, aiming to devise a method of dissemination that would effectively spread the pathogens in optimal concentrations for maximum devastation. His experiments involved the development of biodegradable bombs housing live rats and fleas infected with diseases, designed to explode mid-air, ensuring the safe descent of the infected creatures to the ground. Additionally, he deployed birds and bird feathers contaminated with anthrax from low-flying aircraft. Plague-infected fleas bred in the laboratories of Unit 731 and Unit 1644 were spread by low-flying airplanes over Chinese cities, including the coastal city of Ningbo and Changde in Hunan province in 1940 and 1941. These 2 operations killed tens of thousands with bubonic plague epidemics. An expedition to Nanjing involved spreading typhoid and paratyphoid germs into the wells, marshes and houses of the city, as well as infusing them into snacks distributed to locals. Epidemics broke out shortly after, to the elation of many of the researchers, who concluded that paratyphoid fever was the most effective of the pathogens. The United States Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. holds a set of 3 declassified documents from Unit 731. Each of these 3 documents is more than 100 pages in length, translated from Japanese into English. These documents provided comprehensive clinical records about the daily progression of various pathogens within the bodies of helpless prisoners who were experimented on by Japanese doctors. Japanese soldiers provided testimony indicating that the research programs had the capability to manufacture substantial quantities of biological agents on a monthly basis. 300 kilograms of plague, 500 grams to 7 kilos of anthrax, 800 to 900 kilos of typhoid, and 1,000 kilograms of cholera. Despite the significant production volumes, even small amounts of these bacteria possess the potential to cause severe harm and fatalities. Ishii determined that fleas were an effective carrier for transmitting plague, leading Unit 731 to focus on breeding significant numbers of fleas. To achieve this goal, Unit 731 had approximately 4,500 flea incubators, each capable of producing at least 45 kilograms of fleas per cycle. The substantial quantities of plague bacteria and fleas generated, combined with the severe illness and death rates associated with plague infection, illustrate the formidable biological warfare production capabilities wielded by the Japanese. Japanese researchers had the required materials to apply the scientific method in conducting experiments involving inoculation and the creation of airborne bacterial bombs. Food items emerged as a preferred mechanism of delivery for bacterial transmission. In a specific experiment conducted by Unit 731, typhoid was introduced into melons and cantaloupes. Following the contamination process, the bacterial density was measured. Once reaching a density level, the infected fruit was distributed to a small group of prisoners with the objective of spreading typhoid throughout the entire group. Unit 731 conducted biological warfare field trials by attacking many Chinese civilian populations. During the years from 1940 until 1943, Japanese scientists found that using bacterial bombs for transmission was not effective, but they did find success in utilizing planes to spray microorganisms as a means of biological warfare delivery. Unit 100 also deployed aerial spraying methods akin to those examined by Unit 731. Field trials. At least 12 large-scale bioweapon field trials were carried out by the Japanese on China's civilian population, with at least 11 Chinese cities being attacked with biological agents. An attack on Chengde in 1941 reportedly led to an estimated 10,000 biological casualties, in addition to the deaths of 1,700 Japanese soldiers who were ill-prepared or informed of the trials. Most of those deaths were due to cholera. Japanese researchers performed tests on prisoners with bubonic plague, cholera, smallpox, botulism, and other diseases. This research led to the development of the defolication bacilli bomb and the flea bomb used to spread bubonic plague. Some of these bombs were designed with porcelain shells, an idea first proposed by Ishii in 1938. During biological bomb experiments, researchers dressed in protective suits would examine the dying victims. Infected food supplies and clothing were dropped by airplane into areas of China not occupied by Japanese forces. In addition to this, poisoned food and candy were given to unsuspecting victims. Plague fleas, infected clothing, and other infected supplies encased in bombs were dropped on various targets. The resulting cholera, anthrax, and plague were estimated to have killed at least 400,000 Chinese civilians. Tularemia, or rabbit fever, and even today infects around 200 people annually in the USA, was also tested on Chinese civilians. Due to pressure from numerous accounts of the biowarfare attacks, Chiang Kai-shek sent a delegation of army and field medical personnel in 1941 to document evidence and treat the afflicted. A report on the Japanese use of plague-infected fleas on Chengde was made widely available the following year, but was not addressed by the Allied powers until Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a public warning in 1943 condemning the attacks. In December 1944, the Japanese Navy explored the possibility of attacking cities in California with biological weapons known as Operation PX or Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. The plan for the attack involved Syrian aircraft launched by Senkaku submarine aircraft carriers upon the west coast of the United States and targeting cities such as San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. The planes would spread weaponized bubonic plagues, cholera, typhus, dengue fever, and other pathogens in a biological terror attack upon the population. The submarine crews would infect themselves and run ashore in a suicide mission. Planning for Operation PX was finalized for March 26, 1945, but shelved shortly before it became operational due to strong opposition to the plan from Chief of General Staff Yoshijiro Uzemu. Uzemu later explained his decision as this: if bacteriological warfare is conducted, it will grow from the dimension of war between Japan and America to an endless battle of humanity against bacteria, and Japan will earn the derision of the world. Weapons testing. Human targets were used to test grenades positioned at various distances and in various positions. Flamethrowers were tested on people. Victims were tied to stakes and used as targets to test pathogen-releasing bombs, chemical weapons, shrapnel bombs with varying amounts of fragments, other explosive bombs, bayonets and knives, to determine the best course of treatment for varying degrees of shrapnel wounds sustained in the field by Japanese soldiers. Chinese prisoners were exposed to direct bomb blasts. They were strapped, unprotected, to wooden planks that were staked into the ground at increasing distances around a bomb that was then detonated. It was invasive surgery for those that survived, and autopsies for the majority that didn't. Frostbite testing. Army engineer Hisato Yoshimura conducted experiments by taking captives outside and dipping various appendages into water at various temperatures and allowing the limb to freeze. Once frozen, Yoshimura would strike the affected limbs with a short stick, which emitted a sound resembling that which a board gives when it is struck. Ice was then chipped away, with the affected area being subjected to various treatments. Military personnel of Unit 731 referred to Yoshimura as a scientific devil and a cold-blooded animal due to his strictness and involvement in mass killings and inhumane scientific tests, which included soaking the fingers of a 3-day-old child in water containing ice and salt. Neji Uezono was a member of Unit 731, and an interview conducted in the 1980s revealed a gruesome scene involving Yoshimura. Yoshimura had 2 men naked in an area that was 20 to 30 degrees below 0 Celsius, while researchers filmed the entire process until the subject died. The 2 subjects were in such agony they were digging their nails into each other's flesh, while Yoshimura showed a complete lack of remorse. In an article written in 1950 for the Japanese Journal of Physiology, Yoshimura admitted to using 20 children and a 3-day-old infant in experiments, exposing them to 0 degrees Celsius temperatures involving ice and salt water. Although the article itself drew lots of criticism, Yoshimura denied any guilt when questioned by a reporter from the Mainichi Shimbun. Syphilis. Members of Unit 731 orchestrated acts of forced sex between infected and non-infected prisoners to test how the disease was transmitted. Infection of venereal disease by injection was tried at first, but soon abandoned as researchers started forcing prisoners into sex acts with each other. A male and female prisoner with one infected with syphilis would be brought together in a cell and forced to have sex together. It was made clear to them if they didn't comply, they would be shot. Once victims were infected, they underwent vivisection experiments as their internal organs were observed as the disease progressed. Testimonies from multiple guards of the unit stated that females were usually selected as hosts of the disease. Rape and forced pregnancy. Female prisoners were forced to become pregnant for use in experiments, with testing completed to understand the transmission of diseases from mother to child. Some of these children grew up inside the walls of 731, while others were killed through experimentation alongside their parent. While women prisoners were subjected to a level of degradation through sex experiments, they were also the victims of sex crimes. One guard's testimony graphically demonstrated this reality. One of the former researchers I located told me that one day he had a human experiment scheduled, but there was still time to kill. So he and another unit member took the keys to the cells and opened one that housed a Chinese woman. One of the unit members raped her. The other member took the keys and opened another cell. There was a Chinese woman in there who had been used in a frostbite experiment. She had several fingers missing and her bones were black, with gangrene set in. He was about to rape her anyway. Then he saw that the sex organ was festering, with pus oozing to the surface. He gave up the idea, left and locked the door, then later went on to his experimental work. Other experiments. Unit 731 conducted a wide range of experiments beyond biological warfare, many involving torture, chemical exposure, and physiological manipulation. The following categories summarize the type of experiments carried out. Physical and environmental torture. Prisoners were subjected to extreme methods of physical stress, including prolonged starvation and dehydration, exposure to low-pressure chambers until their eyes burst, suspension upside down until death, crushing with heavy objects, electrocution, forced dehydration using hot air fans, spinning in centrifuges until death, exposure to extreme heat and burns, injection with animal blood including horse blood, injection with seawater, burning or live burial. Dehydration experiments aim to measure total body water content and survival duration without water. Victims were often starved before testing. Staff documented their physical decline at regular intervals. It was said that a small number of these poor men, women and children who became marutas or logs were also mummified alive in total dehydration experiments. They sweated themselves to death at the heat of several hot, dry fans. At death, their corpses would only weigh 1/5 of the normal body weight. Chemical and toxin exposure. Victims were exposed to a wide range of toxic agents including mustard gas, lewisite, cyanic acid gas, white phosphorus, adamsite, phosgene. Unit 731 operated a facility dedicated to gas chamber experiments. Victims were placed in sealed chambers wearing either full uniform, partial gear, or no protection. A former Army Major and later Professor Emeritus recalled, "In 1943, I attended a poison gas test held at Unit 731 test facilities. A glass-walled chamber about 3 meters square and 2 meters high was used. Inside of it, a Chinese man was blindfolded with his hands tied around a post behind him. The gas was adamsite, sneezing gas, and as the gas filled the chamber, the man went into violent coughing convulsions and began to suffer excruciating pain. More than 10 doctors and technicians were present. After I had watched for about 10 minutes, I could not stand it anymore and left the area. I understand that other types of gases were also tested there." Field testing. Unit 731 conducted field trials of chemical weapons. A report from the Kamo Unit described eperite or mustard gas experiments on 7th to 10th of September 1940, including 20 prisoners in various clothing conditions. Subjects were exposed to up to 4,800 artillery rounds. Symptoms were documented at multiple intervals. In one case, fluid from blisters was injected into other subjects and blood and stool were analysed. 5 prisoners were forced to drink eperite lewisite solutions. In the written report, which I've not listed here, one of the prisoners, listed as number 376, condition was described at intervals over the following 36 hours. Blood and toxin research. Tests on blood loss and incompatible blood transfusions were conducted and recorded with prisoners having 500 ml of blood withdrawn from their body every 2 or 3 days. Other experiments included A-type blood given to O-type prisoner and findings recorded, as was similar experimentation on each of the other blood types. Prisoners were also exposed to biological toxins such as tetrodotoxin from pufferfish, heroin, Korean bindweed, bactal and castor oil seeds containing ricin. Other accounts. Former medical worker Takeo Wano claimed to have seen a Western man believed to be Russian cut in half vertically and preserved in former Heilongjiang. Unit 100 reportedly used portable gas chambers for testing. Victims wore military clothing, gas masks, or nothing at all. Some experiments lacked any military rationale. For instance, one Documented tests measured how long it took for 3-day-old babies to freeze to death. Prisoners and victims. Once Japan came to the realization they were defeated in World War II, the fate of those prisoners that remained alive in Unit 731 was sealed. The Japanese murdered every prisoner still alive in the unit. Their remains were then buried in the grounds of Unit 731 after cremation. The following describes the events of those final hours of Unit 731. On August 11th and 12th, approximately 300 prisoners were disposed of. They were coerced into suicide by given a piece of rope. Around 1/4 took their own lives, and the remaining 3/4 who wouldn't consent to suicide were given injections of potassium cyanide. In the end, all were taken care of. In 2002, in Chengde, China, the site of the Plague Flea bombing, there was an international symposium on the crimes of bacterial warfare, which estimated the number of people slaughtered by the Imperial Japanese Army, germ warfare and other human experiments was around 580,000 people, while the American historian Sheldon H. Harris states over 200,000 died. In addition to Chinese casualties, 1,700 Japanese soldiers in Zhejiang were killed by their own biological weapons while attempting to unleash the biological agent, which indicates serious issues with distribution. These soldiers were possibly not informed of the dangerous substances they were handling. The historian Harris also said that plague-infected animals were released near the end of the war, which caused further plague outbreaks that contributed to the deaths of at least 30,000 people in the area around Harbin from 1946 till 1948, while 3,000 men, women and children is a widely accepted figure for those subjected to the horrors of Unit 731. Former unit member Okawa Fukumatsu claimed that there were at least 10,000 victims of experiments at the site, and he claimed he himself conducted vivisections upon thousands. The majority of victims were Chinese, around 70%, with most others being Russian, Mongolian and Korean. There were also reports that a small number of Europeans, American, Indian, Australian and New Zealander prisoners of war may have been sent to Unit 731. Not one prisoner who entered Unit 731 came out alive. Prisoners usually arrived at night in motor vehicles painted black, with a ventilation hole but no windows. On arrival, the prisoners would be transported into the inner prison through secret tunnels. One building housed women and children, another housing the men. On arrival, samples were taken of each prisoner's blood and tests taken to determine their health. Once they were deemed healthy and fit for experimentation, each prisoner lost their name and were given a number of 3 digits, a number they retained until death. Once death occurred, that number would be given to a new arrival. Escape attempts. Despite the prison status as a highly secure building, at least 2 unsuccessful escape attempts did occur. The first recorded escape attempt occurred in May or June of 1943, when one of the prisoners knocked out an inattentive guard and stole his keys. The prisoner then opened all the cell doors and freed up to 100 prisoners. However, they could only escape into the inner courtyard, from which there was no escape route. Because the researchers did not want to kill the prisoners and lose valuable research material, they flooded the area with the pesticide chloropictrin, believing it to be a harmless tear gas. However, the gas proved to be fatal and all the prisoners suffocated. A second attempt occurred in the summer of 1945, when a prisoner had struck an experimenter with a door handle, jumped out of the cell and ran down the corridor, opening cell doors. Some bold prisoners followed him and all were shot for disobeying orders. Unfortunately for the prisoners of Unit 731, escape was an impossibility. Even if they had managed to escape the quadrangle, itself a heavily fortified building full of staff. They would then have had to get over a 3-meter high brick wall surrounding the complex, and then across a dry moat filled with electrified wire running around the perimeter of the complex. Experiments on staff members. Unit 731 members were also subjected to experimentation when they too became infected. Yoshio Tamura, an assistant of the center, recalled how Yoshido Sudo became infected with bubonic plague as a result of working on its production. The team that Tamura worked with were ordered to vivisect Sudo. Tamura recalled Sudo had a few days previously been interested in talking about women, but now he was as thin as a rake, with many purple spots over his body. A large area of scratches on his chest were bleeding. He cried painfully and breathed with difficulty. I sanitized his whole body with disinfectant. Sudo was from that point treated as a test subject with the same lack of care as the prisoners. In another incident, Unit 731 Youth Corps member Yoshio Shinozuka testified that his friend, Junior Assistant Mitsuo Hirakawa, was vivisected as a result of being accidentally infected with plague. Personnel and post-war accountability. Unit 731 included hundreds of military and civilian personnel who participated in wartime human experimentation, biological weapons development and chemical warfare. After Japan's surrender, several members were interned at the Fushan War Criminals Management Center and Taiyuan War Criminals Management Center. Many were later repatriated to Japan, where some became involved in the Association of Returnees from China and testified about their activities. Key personnel. Prominent members of Unit 731 included Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, who was the overall commander, Major General Matsuji Katano, the commander from 1942 to 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Ryoichi Naito, founder of Green Cross, Prince Tsuneyoshi Takeda, Prince Naruhiko Higashikuni, Yoshio Shinozuka, who later gave testimony, as did Yoshiji Kaneko, Shigura Fujita, Ken Yuasa, and civilian employees and students included Shigeo Ozaki, Kiyoshi Monoi, Masatura Saito, and Yoshio Furuichi. Khabarovsk's war crimes trials. 12 former members of Unit 731 and associated units were tried by the Soviet Union in 1949 during the Khabarovsk war crimes trials. Kiyoshi Kawashima held the position of Major General of the Medical Service and was Chief of the General Division from 1939 until 1941, before he held the position of Head of the Production Division until 1945 at Unit 731. He was sentenced to 25 years in a Russian labor camp but was released after 7 years. Otozo Yamada held the military rank of General and was a direct controller from 1941 to 1945 at Units 731 and 100. He too was sentenced to 25 years and only served 7. Ryuji Kajitsuka, he was a Lieutenant General of the Medical Service and Chief of the Medical Administration at Unit 731. He too was sentenced to 25 years, only serving 7. Takatsu Takahashi, he held the military rank of Lieutenant General of the Veterinary Service and was Chief of the Veterinary Service at Unit 731. He was sentenced to 25 years of labour and he died in prison in 1952. Tomio Karasawa, he held the military position of Major of the Medical Service and was the Chief of a section at Unit 731. He was sentenced to 20 years at the labour camp and committed suicide in prison in 1956. Toshihide Nishi, he was a Lieutenant Colonel of the Medical Service and a chief of division at Unit 731. He was sentenced to 18 years at a prison labor camp and served 7 of those years. Matsuo Arnue, a major in the medical service, he was the chief of a branch within Unit 731. He was sentenced to 12 years and served 7. Zenzaku Hirosakura, his military role was as a lieutenant within Unit 100 and sentenced to 10 years labor, of which he served 7. Kazuo Mitoma, he was a senior sergeant within Unit 731 and sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp and subsequently served 7 years. Narimitsu Kikuchi, he was a corporal in the Japanese Army and acted as a probationer medical orderly at Branch 643. He was sentenced to 2 years at a labor camp and served his full term before being released. Yuji Kirishima, he had no military position and was a Japanese civilian orderly in Branch 162. He was sentenced to 3 years at a labor camp and served the full term. Shunji Sato, he was a Major General of the Medical Service and held the role of Chief of the Medical Service of Units 731 and 1644. He was sentenced to 20 years in a labor camp and served 7. Disclosure of the membership list. In April 2018, the National Archives of Japan released a near-complete list of 3,607 personnel affiliated with Unit 731 to Katsuo Nishiyama, a professor at Shiga University of Medical Science. Nishiyama announced his intent to publish the list online to promote further research. To date, that list has not been published. Divisions. Unit 731 was divided into 8 divisions. Division 1 was research on bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid and tuberculosis using live human subjects for this purpose. A prison was constructed to contain around 300 to 400 people. Division 2, research for biological weapons used in the field, in particular the production of devices to spread germs and parasites. Division 3, production of shells containing biological agents stationed in Harbin. Division 4, bacteria mass production and storage. Division 5 was training of personnel. Division 6 to 8 included equipment, medical and administrative units. Facilities. Unit 731 had other units underneath it in the chain of command. There were several other units under the auspice of Japan's biological weapons programs. Most or all units had branch offices, which were also referred to as units. The term Unit 731 can refer to the Harbin complex, or it can refer to the organization and its branches, subunits and their branches. The Unit 731 complex covered 6 square kilometers and consisted of more than 150 buildings. The design of the facilities made them hard to destroy by bombing. The complex contained various factories. It had around 4,500 containers to be used to raise fleas, 6 cauldrons to produce various chemicals, and around 1,800 containers to produce biological agents. Approximately 30 kilograms of bubonic plague bacteria could be produced in a few days. Some of Unit 731's satellite facilities are still in use by various Chinese industrial companies. A portion has been preserved and is open to visitors as a museum. Branches. Unit 731 had branches in Linkou, Heilongjiang, Hainan, Sunwu and Haila. Tokyo, a medical school and research facility belonging to Unit 731, operated in the Shinjuku district of Tokyo during World War II. In 2006, Shiro Ishii, a nurse who worked at the school during the war, revealed that she had helped bury bodies and pieces of bodies on the school's grounds shortly after Japan's surrender in 1945. In response, in February 2011, the Ministry of Health began to evacuate the site. While Tokyo courts acknowledged in 2002 that Unit 731 has been involved in biological warfare research, as of 2011, the Japanese government had made no official acknowledgement of the atrocities committed against test subjects and rejected the Chinese government's requests for DNA samples to identify human remains, including skulls and bones, found near an army medical school. Surrender and immunity, destruction of evidence. As the Second World War started to come to an end, all prisoners within the compound were killed to conceal evidence, and there were no documented survivors. With the coming of the Red Army in 1945, the unit had to abandon their work in haste. Ministries in Tokyo ordered the destruction of all incriminating material, including those in Pingfang. Potential witnesses, such as the 300 remaining prisoners, were either gassed or fed poison, while 600 Chinese and Manchurian labourers were shot. Ishii ordered every member of the group to disappear and take the secret to the grave. Potassium cyanide vials were issued for use in case the remaining personnel were captured. Skeleton crews of Ishii's Japanese troops blew up the compound in the final days of the war to destroy evidence of their activities, but many were sturdy enough to remain somewhat intact. Former Unit 731 member Hideo Shimizu stated that during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, he was instructed to eliminate evidence by burning the victims in the courtyard, collecting leftover bones from the area, and then destroying the remains with explosives. While boarding a departing train, he was provided with a cyanide compound and instructed to commit suicide instead of being captured. American grant of immunity from Unit 731 to Fort Detrick. What is the USA hiding from the world? Among the individuals in Japan after its 1945 surrender was Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, who arrived in Yokohama via the American ship Sturgis in September 1945. Sanders was a highly regarded microbiologist and a member of America's Military Center for Biological Weapons. Sanders' duty was to investigate Japanese biological warfare activity. At the time of his arrival in Japan, he had no knowledge of what Unit 731 was, until Sanders finally threatened the Japanese with bringing the Soviets into the picture. Little information about biological warfare was being shared with the Americans. The Japanese wanted to avoid prosecution under the Soviet legal system, so the morning after he made his threat, Sanders received a manuscript describing Japan's involvement in biological warfare. So what are the Americans keeping hidden? Sanders took this information to General Douglas MacArthur, who was the Supreme Commander of the Allied powers and responsible for rebuilding Japan during the Allied occupations. MacArthur struck a deal with Japanese informants. He secretly granted immunity to the physicians of Unit 731, including their leader, in exchange for providing exclusive American access to their research on biological warfare and data from human experimentation. American occupation authorities monitored the activities of former unit members, including reading and censoring their mail. The Americans believed that the research data was valuable and did not want other nations, particularly the Soviet Union, to acquire data on biological weapons. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal heard only one reference to Japanese experiments with poisonous serums on Chinese civilians. This took place in August 1946 and was instigated by Joseph R. Massey, assistant to the Chinese prosecutor. The Japanese Defense Council argued that the claim was vague and uncorroborated, and it was dismissed by the tribunal president, Sir William Webb, for lack of evidence. The subject was not pursued further by Massey, who was probably unaware of Unit 731's activities. His reference to it at the trial was believed to have been accidental. Later in 1981, one of the last surviving members of the Tokyo Tribunal, Judge Rowling, had expressed bitterness in not being made aware of the suppression of evidence of Unit 731 and wrote, It is a bitter experience for me to be informed now that centrally ordered Japanese war criminality of the most disgusting kind was kept secret from the court by the US government. American investigations into Japanese war crimes ceased when Japanese scientists began disclosing information on biological warfare. Despite the establishment of their own research program, American scientists faced a significant gap in essential knowledge regarding biological warfare. The potential value to the Americans of Japanese provided data encompassing human research subjects, delivery system theories, and successful real field trials was immense. However, historian Sheldon H. Harris concluded that Japanese data failed to meet American standards, suggesting instead that the findings from the unit were of minor importance at best. Harris characterized the research results from the Japanese camp as disappointing, concurring with the assessment of Murray Sanders, who characterized the experiments as crude and ineffective. While German physicians were brought to trial and had their crimes publicized, the US concealed information about Japanese biological warfare experiments and secured immunity for the perpetrators. Critics have argued that racism led to a double standard in the American post-war responses to the experiments conducted on different nationalities. Whereas the perpetrators of Unit 731 were exempt from prosecution, the US held a tribunal in Yokohama in 1948 that indicted 9 Japanese physician professors and medical students for conducting vivisection upon captured American pilots. 2 professors were sentenced to death, the others to 15 to 20 years imprisonment. Was this an act of double standards by the US? They practically ignored the crimes against Chinese and others at Unit 731 and elsewhere, and only prosecuted those responsible for crimes against Americans. Separate Soviet trials. Although publicly silent on the issue of the Tokyo trials, the Soviet Union pursued the case and prosecuted 12 top military leaders and scientists from Unit 731 and its affiliated biological war prisons, Unit 1644 in Nanjing and Unit 100 in Changchun in the Khabarovsk war crimes trials. Among those accused of war crimes, including germ warfare, was General Otsuto Yamada, Commander-in-Chief of the million-man Kwantung Army occupying Manchuria. The trial of the Japanese perpetrators was held in Khabarovsk in December 1949. A lengthy, partial transcript of trial proceedings was published in different languages the following year by the Moscow Foreign Language Press, including an English language edition. The lead prosecuting attorney of the Khabarovsk trial was Len Smimov, who had been one of the top Soviet prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials. The Japanese doctors and army commanders who had perpetrated the Unit 731 experiments received sentences from the Khabarovsk court ranged from 2 to 25 years in a Siberian labor camp. The United States refused to acknowledge the trials, branding them communist propaganda. The sentences doled out to the Japanese perpetrators were unusually lenient by Soviet standards, and all of the defendants returned to Japan by 1956. In addition to the accusations of propaganda, the US also asserted that the trials served as a distraction from the Soviet treatment of several 100,000 Japanese prisoners of war. Meanwhile, the USSR asserted that the US had given the Japanese diplomatic leniency in exchange for information about their human experimentation. However, it is likely that former Unit 731 members had also passed information about their biological experimentation to the Soviet government in exchange for the additional leniency. The Soviet Union built a biological weapons facility in Sverdlovsk using documentation captured from 731 in Manchuria. Official silence during the American occupation of Japan. As above, during the United States occupation of Japan, the members of Unit 731 and the members of other experimental units were allowed to go free. On 6th of May 1947, Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, wrote to Washington in order to inform it that additional data, possibly some statements from Ishii, can probably be obtained by informing Japanese involved that information will be retained in intelligence channels and will not be employed as war crimes evidence. And according to an investigation by the British newspaper The Guardian, at the end of the war, under pretense of vaccine development, former members of Unit 731 conducted human experiments on Japanese prisoners, babies and mental patients with secret funding from the US government. One graduate of Unit 1644, Masami Kitaoka, continued to perform experiments on unwilling Japanese subjects from 1947 to 1956. He performed his experiments while he was working for Japan's National Institute for Health Services. He infected prisoners with rickettsia and infected mentally ill patients with typhus. As the chief of that unit, Shiro Ishii was granted immunity from prosecution for war crimes by the American occupation authorities because he had provided human experimentation research materials to them. From 1948 to 1958, less than 5% of the documents were transferred onto microfilm and stored in the US National Archives before they were shipped back to Japan. Post-occupation Japanese media coverage and debate. Japanese discussions of Unit 731's activity began in the 1950s after the end of the American occupation of Japan. In 1952, an infant girl at Nagoya City Pediatric Hospital died after being infected with E. coli bacteria. The incident was publicly tied to former Unit 731 scientists. Later in that decade, journalists suspected that the murders attributed by the government to Sadamichi Hirasawa were actually carried out by members of Unit 731. In 1957, Japanese author Shusaku Endo published the book The Sea and Poison about human experimentation in Fukuoka, which is thought to have been based on a real incident. In 1950, former members of Unit 731, including Masaji Katano, founded the blood bank and pharmaceutical company Green Cross, for which Murray Saunders also served as a consultant. The company became the target of a scandal in the 1980s after up to 3,000 Japanese contracted HIV through the distribution and use of its blood products, which the Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices Agency had deemed unsafe. The author, Seiichi Morimura, published The Devil's Gluttony in 1981, followed by The Devil's Gluttony, a sequel, in 1983. These books purported to reveal the true operations of Unit 731, but falsely attributed unrelated photos to the unit, which raised questions about their accuracy. Also, in 1981, the first direct testimony of human vivisection in China was given by Ken Yuasa. Since then, much more in-depth testimony has been given in Japan. A 2001 documentary, Japanese Devils, largely consists of interviews with 14 Unit 731 staff members taken prisoner by China and later released. Prince Mikasa, who was the younger brother of Hirohito, toured the Unit 731 headquarters in China and wrote in his memoir that he watched films showing how Chinese prisoners were made to march on the plains of Manchuria for poison gas experiments on humans. Hideki Tojo, who later became Prime Minister in 1941, was also shown films of the experiments, which he described as unpleasant. Significance in post-war research on biowarfare and medicine. Despite conducting scientific experiments, Unit 731 faced scrutiny regarding the usefulness of the data produced from these experiments. Japanese biological warfare operations were by far the largest during World War II, and possibly with more people and resources than the BW producing nations of France, Hungary, Italy, Poland and the Soviet Union combined between the world wars. Despite the apparent success, Unit 731 lacked adequate scientific and engineering foundations to further maximize its effectiveness. Harris concluded that US scientists generally wanted to acquire it due to the concept of forbidden fruit, believing that lawful and ethical prohibitions could affect the outcomes of their research. Historian Till Winfried Barnighausen criticized the overall lack of scientific rigor in many of Unit 731's experiments, but he noted some exceptions. He pointed to the mustard gas, freezing and tuberculosis experiments as having a reliable and valid data collection process, suggesting they were conducted with greater rigor. In 1969, Ikeda Niao, a physician associated with Unit 731, published his own research on epidemic hemorrhagic fever. His paper documented experiments conducted at a military hospital on the China-Soviet border in January 1942. These experiments, involving infections on humans, confirmed the transmission of EHF by lice and fleas to local populations, resulting in deaths among those infected. Despite the explicit admission of conducting experiments on humans with fatal pathogenic inoculations, Ikeda's report passed peer review and was published in a Japanese scholarly journal. The acceptance of this research by Ikeda underscored the widespread acknowledgement within the Japanese medical community of the human experiments conducted at Unit 731. During the war, Yoshimura Hasato conducted research at Unit 731 in China, focusing on low-temperature physiology, particularly studying the mechanisms involved in frostbite. Following the war, he established the Japanese Society of Biometeorology. His research in China marked the inception of his exploration into the relationship between physiology and environmental stress. Most researchers at Unit 731 did not engage in a concerted effort to conceal the experiments they participated in. While they refrained from publicly acknowledging their crimes, they did share various details within their medical circles. Consequently, especially regarding research on EHF and frostbite, it has been relatively straightforward to ascertain who conducted which types of human experiments. Given that nearly all members of the Japanese medical community were aware of the human experiments conducted at Unit 731, researchers from the unit were able to later publish their work on medical papers. Even after the war, reports were disseminated unmistakably detailing the results of experiments on humans, and accounts of the unit were documented on medical journals. This indicates widespread awareness within the Japanese medical community regarding the experiments carried out at Unit 731. During the COVID-19 pandemic, some scientists called for experimental data from Unit 731 to be publicly released to the international medical community because the data available on human pathogen interactions could have helped epidemiologists with pandemic control. The information was withheld by both the US and Japanese governments. Official government response in Japan. In 1983, the Japanese Ministry of Education asked Japanese historian Saburo Ienaga to remove a reference from one of his textbooks that stated Unit 731 conducted experiments on thousands of Chinese. The ministry alleged that no academic research supported the claim. In 1984, Japanese historian Shunichi Karichi translated and published over 4,000 pages of US documents on Japanese biological warfare. The ministry backed down after new studies were published in Japan and important evidence surfaced in the United States. Japanese history textbooks usually contain references to 731, but the textbooks do not provide specific details about the activities conducted at the facility. Saburo Inaga's New History of Japan included a detailed description based on officers' testimony. The Ministry for Education attempted to remove this passage from his textbook before it was taught in public schools on the basis that testimony was insufficient. The Supreme Court of Japan ruled in 1997 that the testimony was indeed sufficient and that requiring it to be removed was an illegal violation of freedom of speech. In 1997, international lawyer Konan Suiya filed a class action suit against the Japanese government demanding reparations for the actions of Unit 731, using evidence filed by Professor Makoto Ueda of Rikyo University. All levels of the Japanese court system found the suit baseless. No findings of fact were made about the existence of human experimentation. In August 2002, the Tokyo District Court ruled for the first time that Japan had engaged in biological warfare. Presiding Judge Koji Iwata ruled that Unit 731, on the orders of the Imperial Japanese Army headquarters, used bacteriological weapons on Chinese civilians between 1940 and 1942, spreading diseases including plague and typhoid in the cities of Chuzhou, Ningbo and Changde. He rejected victims' compensation claims on the grounds that they had already been settled by international peace treaties. In October 2003, a member of Japan's House of Representatives filed an inquiry. Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi responded that the Japanese government did not then possess any records related to Unit 731, but recognized the gravity of the matter and will publicize any records located in the future. In April 2018, the National Archives of Japan released the names of 3,607 members of Unit 731 in response to a request by Professor Katsuo Nishiyama of the Shiga University of Medical Science. It took almost 60 years for the Japanese government to acknowledge the atrocities of Unit 731 and the compelling evidence of its government's knowledge or involvement in those atrocities. Even today, they have failed to provide a full apology for those events and more on the people of China. Reaction from overseas. After World War II, the Office of Special Investigations created a watch list of suspected Axis collaborators and persecutors banned from entering the United States. While over 60,000 names were added to the watch list, fewer than 100 Japanese participants were identified. In a 1998 correspondence letter between the DOJ and Rabbi Abraham Cooper, L.A. Rosenbaum, director of OSI, stated that this was due to two factors. Number one, while most documents captured by the US and Europe were microfilmed before being returned to their respective governments, the Department of Defense decided not to microfilm its vast collection of documents before returning them to the Japanese government. The Japanese government has also failed to grant the OSI meaningful access to these and related records after the war. While European countries, on the other hand, were largely cooperative, the cumulative effect was that information needed to identify these individuals became, in effect, impossible to recover. Surely questions must be asked why the actions mentioned above were not taken, or was it just more evidence of the US covering up for Japanese war crimes? That brings us to the end of this video, highlighting a period of Chinese history that occurred from the 1930s and 40s to the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. If this video has helped in your understanding of past historical events here in China, then your subscribing to my channel would mean a lot to me. Thank you for watching. Make sure you click on the link to the next video, and until the next time, goodbye for now.